Bonjour à toutes et à tous. Hello, everyone. As the director of HEC Montreal, it is a real pleasure to welcome you to this roundtable organized in collaboration with HEC Montreal as we address lessons to be learned from COVID-19 pandemic for greening the economy. La pandémie de la COVID-19 a bouleversé les économies du monde entier. Elle a mis en lumière à quel point nos économies sont vulnérables, car interconnectées. Elle a aussi démontré qu'il était possible de rapidement modifier nos habitudes pour limiter l'ampleur de la crise sanitaire. Le bilan n'est cependant pas parfait. Si l'agilité de plusieurs secteurs d'activité à revoir leur façon de faire est un élément extrêmement encourageant, la résistance de certains individus à se conformer à des mesures qui pourtant contribuent au bien commun illustre bien la fragilité de la cohésion sociale. La crise climatique présente plusieurs similarités avec la pandémie. Il s'agit d'une crise mondiale. Toutes les populations ne sont pas affectées de la même manière, avec des impacts disproportionnés pour les communautés les plus pauvres et les moins éduquées. Pour la résoudre, il faut agir en collaboration et de façon globale, et les bénéfices de nos efforts ne se feront pas ressentir immédiatement. Peut-on tirer des leçons de la pandémie pour cette autre crise imminente et mondiale qu'est la crise climatique? La sortie de crise de la pandémie peut-elle servir de tremplin à une économie plus verte? Quelles sont les actions à prioriser? Pour trouver les réponses à ces questions et identifier des solutions pérennes et socialement responsables à ces deux crises, qui ont un impact profond autant sur nos vies personnelles que sur le monde du travail et toute la société, les universités ont assurément un rôle à jouer, tant par la recherche que par l'enseignement. Les défis auxquels la pandémie nous ont confrontés nous confirment l'importance et la pertinence de notre engagement à HEC Montréal à former des leaders en gestion qui contribuent de manière responsable au succès des organisations et au développement durable de la société. Elle montre également à quel point il est pertinent pour une école de gestion d'inscrire au cœur de sa mission le développement durable, mais également la valorisation de la responsabilité sociale et l'éthique des affaires. Our panel today will be moderated by Justin Leroux, Professor of Applied Economics at HEC Montréal. Mr. Leroux's research interests focus on public and environmental policy. His research focuses on environmental taxation mechanisms, such as climate liabilities. He will be accompanied by three specialists with complementary expertise. I now give the floor to Mr. Leroux, who will introduce each of them to you. Thank you very much. Merci, bonne conférence.
Welcome, everyone. We are joined today by a very distinguished panel, which is a mixed panel of academia and speakers from the financial sector. So in academia, we have Professor Tito Michele Bueri, who's a professor of economics at Bocconi University. And from the financial sector, we're joined by Kathy Bardswick, who's chair of Sustainable Finance Action Council, and Sean Kidney, who is the CEO of the Climate Bonds Initiative. As Professor Passin's introduction has revealed, we are going to be discussing to what extent we can learn from the pandemic that we are going through, exiting maybe, perhaps, if we want to become optimistic, be optimistic. To what extent can we learn from this pandemic, learn lessons that will be applied and that can be applicable to the climate crisis? The climate crisis has been going on for some years. It's a long-term process of which the effects are already felt today, and the most recent report of the Intergovernmental Panel of Climate Change, the IPCC, makes it clear, if it wasn't already, that human activity is very much a driver of this climate change. To what extent can we apply the lessons that we're learning with the COVID pandemic to the climate crisis? Before we answer the question in the broad strokes that this panel can afford us due to its complementarity, I would like each of the speakers to perhaps introduce themselves in a few words. So, who would like to start? Maybe Kathy, perhaps? Ms. Barswick, I should say.
Okay, thank you very much, Justin, and thank you for inviting me to this panel. I'm joined by two very esteemed colleagues, and I'm looking forward to learning from them. As you say, my name is Kathy Barswick, and I'm currently chair of a relatively new initiative commitment that the Government of Canada put in place, and it's referred to as the Sustainable Finance Action Council. And what it is a group of 25 of the largest financial services organizations across 4 sectors in the country coming together to execute on a mandate that in essence is to build out a more robust sustainable finance ecosystem for the country. And they represent the banking, the pension, the life insurance, and the property and casualty insurance industry. So I am really pleased to be able to work alongside these 25 organizations who are essential from a financial services perspective to the challenges the country is facing, particularly related to financing our journey from here to a 2050 net zero. My previous background was in the insurance industry. I spent many years, too many years to share. It'll date me, but primarily in the property and casualty industry. Though the organization that I was the CEO of was also in asset management and life insurance. So I had a very acute awareness over the years of the increasing challenge associated with climate change and the devastation that it was creating in communities across the globe. So I come here with that innate sense of such a critical need for us as a financial system to be a part of the solution and contribute in a critical way, not only in financing the needs of our journey, our transition journey, but also to support in action the products and services on the ground that our communities need. So I'll leave it at that, Justin.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Yes, the previous organization that you were the CEO of is the Cooperators, which is a part of the insurance sector. You did not name it. I assumed it was not a secret. I'm naming it for you. So, Professor Brady, could you tell us about yourself, please?
My field of expertise is more on social policy and labor market policies. I'm particularly interested in issues related to income distribution, and I had also some experience in international organization and in public administration, as I was running until a few years ago. I was president of Italian Social Security Administration. So I'm very much looking forward to interaction with my colleagues and the other speakers at this panel.
Thank you very much.
And I'm Sean Kidney. I'm the CEO of the Climate Bonds Initiative. We're a global NGO dedicated to mobilizing capital for climate action. We're kind of the global NGO for green bonds, which is a market that's green and sustainable bonds are approaching $2 trillion US outstanding. We work on standards, on research, on certification, on taxonomies, as we call it in Europe nowadays, definitions of what can be a qualifying investment. Work with governments. I'm an advisor, have been an advisor to the People's Bank of China. I'm an advisor to the European Commission. And we work in many countries of governments in Brazil, in India, in ASEAN and Japan. That's the exciting story is, of course, this vast growth of a market, which will grow 80% this year, and we expect it to grow another 80% next year. Now, the question is, will we grow it fast enough in Canada? Kathy will probably answer that question for us in a minute.
Kathy Barswick, do you have an answer to that question? How are we growing in Canada in terms of sustainable finance? Is that something you would be interested in responding to?
So Tito, based on our prep call, we were going to begin with perhaps you providing your perspective on key learnings that you would share with the group associated with what we've been going through with the pandemic and its applications to our significant global climate challenge here. So, Tito, did you want to begin?
Yes, why not? Thank you. Yes, no, I think that one of the key lessons we learned from the pandemic is that what we call negative externalities are so important and so widespread. You know, whenever we take an action, this has consequences, unintended consequences on other people that who didn't play any role in this, in our decision. But clearly, these consequences can be more or less serious. In the case of a pandemic, they were extremely serious. You know, the decision of a teacher not to get vaccinated could clearly increase very much the risk of contagion among the students, among the parents of the students, among the colleagues, and clearly put at risk the health of many other people. The decision of a rich country not to immediately spread the vaccine and involve developing nations in the vaccination campaign and keep the vaccine for themselves had also very deep implication on the spread of the virus and on the development of new variants. So this example also suggests and lessons that we learn from the pandemic, but there is clearly an issue of coordination. But at the national level can be done by governments. Indeed, governments have been acting very much, have been putting and enforcing very strict legislation, preventing a lot of behavior from individuals, restricting the freedoms based on the principle that your freedom ends where clearly the rights of the others begin. So it was a right decision to do so, but the national level is not sufficient. The coordination at the national level is not sufficient. You need to have something more than that. You need to have cross-country coordination. And that is clearly the case. I hope that the pandemic will develop a new awareness on the fact that we need way more cross-country coordination. Environmental issues are typically an area where without cross-country coordination, you cannot really enforce any serious measure. So that perhaps is something that we are learning, hopefully, from this pandemic, and hopefully will guide also future decision on environmental issues.
So thank you, Tito, for this call. That yes, we need to have better coordination, and indeed, because with the COVID crisis, this is a very much shorter term consequences than with the climate crisis. So perhaps if we learn to act together in a coordinated way, perhaps this paves the way to better coordination for the climate crisis. And your work on social cohesion is definitely an important reason why we were hoping you would accept our invitation today.
So, Justin, if I may, I'd like to build on Tito's call. When I think of his point about collaboration and better coordination, and our institutions, decades-old institutions, were structured and were built over time when that wasn't paramount in our minds to the same extent that I think it's so critically important that we think about how we're going to deal with this concept of whole of society or, whole of government, which is what the climate challenge is going to require. And I think it's one of the critical learnings that I take from the pandemic is the fact that, as Tito's pointed out, it's fine for us to bring the science together and to drive a pandemic solution associated with the vaccine. But until and unless we have a whole of society approach and strategic execution, the vaccine is not very valuable until it's actually in the arms of people around the world. So what does that take in terms of our ability to collaborate and cooperate with each other, when in fact, in some ways, we're seeing the reverse, where we are tending to hunker down and become more internally focused. And that concerns me, because I think the positive learning of the pandemic for me is the critical need for us to find better ways to collaborate and cooperate. And I'll use, in the climate space, the example that we're certainly looking at here in Canada associated with the uptake of EVs. We can build the infrastructure We can have the charging stations, we can build out the grid requirements, but until and unless we have people buying those cars, we have the manufacturers providing them, but we also have the buyers actually buying them. This again speaks to the critical importance of this whole of society view. And I was listening to some earlier conversation at this conference earlier today, where we were talking about the challenges associated with building out resilience versus the focus on mitigation and emissions reduction. And we can't look at those in isolation. We need such an integrated view, and we need to drive that integration and look at this through that integrated lens if we're going to be able to solve the very complex issues associated with climate. So it needs a different perspective, a different lens, our ability to look at building out our capacity to be interdisciplinary in the true sense of the word, where we're executing from beginning to end through that interdisciplinary lens. So I would certainly highlight that as a key learning that I would carry forward from the pandemic.
I've got 3 key learnings from my perspective. The first is there are some implications of understanding this is a climate biodiversity event. We now know that the source of the pandemic is in biodiversity collapse and zoonotic diseases, pathogens jumping between species. This isn't a one-off. The Intergovernmental Panel of Climate Change has got a health committee that's been predicting a century of pandemics for 30 years now. And if you talk to Pavan Sukhdev, the global president of WWF, he will describe the series of epidemics we've had in the last 20 years as attempts by the earth, if you like, to shake off the parasite, attempts at parasite. One was going to get away. We're lucky. I have to say, it's horrible to say this, given the brutal impacts of the pandemic. We're lucky it wasn't SARS that got away, because in that case, it had a mortality rate of 20%, affecting 30 to 40-year-olds, but largely would have been a very different social and economic outcome if that one had got away. There will be more. There's one thing that's absolutely certain. Whenever we've had periods of climate change, the end of the Roman Empire, medieval times, the 1600s, all of which are associated with major climate volatility, we've had pandemics globally. So we know very well that this will lead to further ones. So we need to prepare. First thing is the climate impacts are happening. It's not just an isolation pandemic, it's part of a cluster of volatile impacts that we're now experiencing. And look at the wildfires in Siberia now, the heat dome in Vancouver. These things, the last year has been full of these sorts of things, but certainly the pandemic is the worst one. The key lesson out of the pandemic in the short term, from my perspective, is listen to the scientists. Whoa, haven't we taken a while to figure out that one when it comes to climate change? Well, we learnt the hard way when it came to the pandemic that if you don't listen to the scientists and act, it gets away from you. In the UK, where famously the Prime Minister has continued to overrule the scientists, every time they delay lockdown 3 weeks or 6 weeks, we get a huge uptick in numbers, and we've had 60,000 reported deaths here and something like 220,000 excess deaths in the UK for the population it is, let alone in Bolsonaro's Brazil or the US or India. Listen to the scientists is the next thing. The second point I'd make is we've learned that resilience is now paramount. We've had a major crisis. We're going to have more of these. We now need to be thinking about resilience. When we think about climate change, we need to think about resilience as physical, like, flood defences or trying to save Miami skyscrapers from going underwater, whatever. The truth is, resilience is much more than that. When societies are hit by impacts such as pandemics, such as storms, such as heat instances, we have to be prepared for health resilience. That's what, if you look at the difference between the US and Canada, there are some characteristics we now understand about health resilience. Free healthcare is a key feature of a resilient health system. If people who are on low wages can't afford to go to a doctor, they will keep working to feed their kids and the disease spreads. That's what we've seen in multiple countries. If people can get free healthcare immediately and get some kind of sickness benefit as a guaranteed, they will be able to stay at home sick and look after their kids and still feed them, etc., etc. You're going to have less runaway effects of the pandemic. And that's a key lesson out of this, but it applies to more than that in terms of the economic shock that will become a norm in the 21st century, from the pandemic to other kinds of incidences. We now know that we've got to prepare for them, and we need to support people, whether it be furlough schemes or checks to people or whatever. We've learned the hard way. In fact, we've adopted this the last year, a whole lot of things that were off the table a few years ago, because in most economies, we've understood these are critical to keep the economies going. You know, there's something else about the economic and social resilience, which is about inequality. We need to understand that these are features of equality or inequality. It's a material issue when it comes to addressing something like a pandemic. The more inequality you have, the less access to services, the less ability to be able to feed your kids, the more we're going to have runaway climate change. And there's a whole bunch of literature which we can get out of this in these areas. We've just ran, folks, for the last 18 months, a global experiment on different responses to the pandemic around the world. We're going to have so much data. Tito's students are going to go crazy with research opportunities out of this. And we need to listen to that, because learning from the data and learning what works, what doesn't work is critically urgent for us, because we're going into a century or more of this. But my last point is picking up Tito's point. We've learned about the need to collaborate. We didn't collaborate a lot of the time. We still have some outrageous examples of vaccine inequality going on around the world. You know, where we're stockpiling vaccines in the US and some European countries, and we have people still dying across Africa or Latin America, which of course will guarantee mutations of the disease, and that will come back and bite us all in the bum. Unless we take a proper global approach to things like vaccine equality, we are not going to be able to make progress on this. There were proposals in the early stages of the pandemic to be able to split vaccine production around the world and to do it in relative equity. We lost that. We didn't collaborate. In fact, we had a US president arranging to steal PPE off another country on the tarmac in Bangkok, and we had a similar thing going on with vaccines. We failed miserably. And in the midst of this crisis, as we learned that international institutions are critical for being able for this collaboration, like the World Health Organization, what did we have? A debate, in fact, an attempt to totally cut the funding of the World Health Organization because of a kind of nationalism that arose out of it. This is going to be the risk, by the way. Every time we have an incident along these lines, which we're going to have a lot of this century, let me say it again, we need to now strengthen those international institutions quickly while we have a breather to prepare for the next crash. Otherwise, we will descend into nationalist, populist responses and atomization of the world order, which will guarantee that whole sections of the world suffer from famine or plague or pandemics or other kinds of activities, and then eventually comes and bites in the bum. In fact, it'll also reduce mitigation opportunities, because the more populists are in the power, the less mitigation happens. So this world order, which should be showing up as things like tripling the budget for the UN High Commissioner of Refugees. We already have more refugees on the planet than ever before. We're going to see a quadrupling and a quintupling of that in the next 10 years. It should be a tripling of the budget of the World Health Organization, so it can do preparatory work. It should be setting up in advance collaborative agreements, trade agreements between major economies for things like PPE and vaccine sharing that we might have a chance to hold. All of these things we can now anticipate. The last 18 months has given that. And the next 18 months is the time to prepare.
Thank you very much, Sean. So you actually preceded my next question, which was going to be about concrete solutions, and you've already mentioned a few. You know, you have to listen to science, you have to implement universal healthcare, reduce inequality across countries, and, as Kathy had mentioned earlier, refurbish, if you will, these institutions that were designed in a different time where it was not as clear that we needed to cooperate so much and collaborate so much. And thank you also for highlighting that the pandemic is actually a result of climate change and of human emissions in an indirect way, but still it is a result. And perhaps because it is so international, perhaps it is the consequence of climate change that will maybe get us to wake up and and realize some things that we don't realize when the consequences take the form of losses of biodiversity. Directly speaking, we all think of this poor polar bear on its ice cube, and we think, okay, well, this is terrible, and because it's a cute animal, we don't. But we're talking about loss of biodiversity with the consequences that diseases actually crop up and take hold. But also, when it's torrential rains, when it is wildfires, it's also very isolated and located in a certain specific way. And also it seems that even when it's hurricanes, we think, well, we just had a few more hurricanes this year. Is it really a big deal? And it's just this local population. But when it's a pandemic that reaches us all, we tend to think differently. And like you said, this is very much an experiment that we've had around the world. And I would like to give a chance to Tito and Kathy to perhaps, what would be their practical solutions? And I'm sure many of them coincide with the ones that you have mentioned, Sean. And what are solutions that perhaps the financial sector or the economic sector could try to mobilize?
Should I start?
If you will, absolutely.
Sure.
Kathy, perhaps you want to go first?
No, go ahead, Tito.
I think that both Kathy and Sean said very important things on coordination and inequality. So I think these are two key principles that also would drive any proposal as to concrete things with them. I think we had also lessons in developing countries and developed nations about attempts to introduce environmentally sound legislation that failed because they didn't address the distributional consequences of these policies. The typical case is what has been going on in France, as there was an attempt to introduce a carbon tax without really thinking about the impact such a move could have on income distribution. We do remember, all of us, the phenomenon, the movement of a Gilets jaunes and what has been going on in that country. I think here we should be aware of the fact that these policies that want to discourage behavior which is not environmentally sound and that increase emissions and pollution are, this Pigouvian, as we call taxation, is not something that is aimed at easing revenues of the state. Certainly, this is not the policy to reduce the huge public debt that we are going to have as a legacy of the pandemic. This policy aims exclusively at discouraging these negative externalities. That's the only real scope and proposal and idea beyond this policy and this type of taxation. So the proceeds of the taxes should not be used by government to reduce their debt, but should be used to redistribute, to address the negative, unintended and negative distributional effect of these policies. In the case of Gilets jaunes, I think that the French government would have taken a right decision in setting immediately from the very start that people at the low end of income distribution losing because of this policy would have been compensated in order not to have any effect on their income levels. And if such a move had been taken, I'm sure that the reaction of the French population to the adoption of this type of policy would have been way different than it was. At international level, we have to apply similar principle, compensate and redistribute. Also, because here we have a problem that often, those who are really paying the cost of the environmental of the climate change are the population, the countries that play a relatively minor role in pollution. If you think about developing countries, torrential floods and drought and all of this very extreme environmental condition they get into, and clearly the pollution is concentrated in developed nations. So there as well, it's very important to adopt a better redistribution. I'm chairing a group which is working in parallel to the G20 these days. And in that context, we developed a number of proposals in improving redistribution across countries. Some of them have to do with capital taxation, international capital taxation. You know that there are a lot of talks right now about introducing a minimum tax on corporate incomes. Here there is a proposal to have a tax on the stock market value of a large corporation worldwide. A very modest one, but that could be used to compensate countries in developing world. And could also be used to introduce a safety net in these countries. I think that this policy would be very important to improve also the possibility to strengthen coordination at the international, on the global scale.
Thank you very much. Kathy, would you like to add to that?
Yeah, maybe I'll focus a little more tactically then. Based on the fact that both Sean and Tito have been talking about some of the global efforts that we need to turn our attention to or strengthen. We know a lot. We know a lot today. We know what we have to do more quickly. The last 2 years I spent helping to build out a climate research institute, and we came to refer to the science that we know today and the sorry, I have to plug in my computer or else I'm going to lose you. The science that we know today and the actions that we know we need to take today are clear. So get on with it. Let's roll up our sleeves and just get on with it. We call this safe bets. And it's not perfection. We don't need perfection. We just need a whole lot of really good stuff to happen today that we know needs to happen today. And those are the safe bets that all countries have already identified and know they need to get on with. So what's preventing us from moving more quickly to implement those commitments that we know are critically important if we're going to take the incremental but absolutely necessary progress steps that are required to get us to our 2050 targets? And there is some uncertainty, and that's where we need more courage. We need private sector courage. We need public policy courage. We need the ability to hold each other accountable. We need to call each other out when we're not seeing the kind of progress that needs to be made. And at the end of the day, we also need to be prepared to measure and report far more effectively and in a more robust way, aligned with both, these immediate safe bet progress areas that we need to make and the longer term, more courageous and less certain investments that we need to make as well. And that's going to take courage. But my sense is that we feel somewhat, given the pandemic, and here's maybe another learning, given the pandemic and the immediate short-term effort and energy that was required to turn our attention to immediate response, we know it's doable. We know it's possible. Humanity, has such capacity when we feel that level of immediacy and crisis that I think we are increasingly now realizing we're facing when it comes to climate. To Sean's point, and from my historical perspective, climate change is here. It is wreaking havoc. No country is unscathed. No community can say that it's unscathed. And so the crisis is here. And as with the pandemic, we know what to do, turn our attention to doing those immediate short-term defined responses that each country has already identified. Many of the countries have already identified are required. The build out of EV capacity, cleaning our electrical supply, doing the kinds of efficiency retrofits that are needed, encouraging and ensuring that we're looking at this through an integrated, broader social perspective so that we are bringing an inclusive and equitable solution to the public policy decisions that we make, and get on with it. Hold each other accountable when we don't see that we're not getting on with it. So I'd really like us to, yes, understand that we've got these kinds of sessions and processes where, we need to compare notes and learn from each other, but we've got to turn a lot more of our energy to execution and action on the ground than is currently happening.
You're absolutely right, Kathy. if we're clear, we kind of know what the challenge is. We know what the solutions are. There's not a lot of rocket science here when it comes to the mitigation side. However, on the resilience side, this is an agenda that we haven't really understood beyond the physical resilience activities, which are becoming better known and better understood. But, in a world of volatility, there has to be a premium on social and economic resilience in a way that wasn't before. Because every 3 years, every economy is going to be hit by some kind of whammo from left side and is going to have to try and recover, whether it be a pandemic in Italy or whether it be floods in China. So we need to plan for that. No, we can plan for that. And so when we talk about the sorts of things that are relevant to addressing climate change, it's no longer getting emissions down. That's the near and present danger. That's about getting us off the railroad tracks before the freight train hits, fundamentally, which is really important. But we've also got to prepare for a world which is going to see change. The emissions that we put in the last 30 years globally are more than the emissions we put in the previous 150 years. And latency effect in climate is about 30 years. That is the climate impacts we're experiencing now to do with the emissions we put in 1990. So if you think many more emissions, even if we stop the emissions cold dead tomorrow morning, we're going to get 30 years of increased climate change. We're going to hit 2-degree warming at best. Then the goal is to try and get it back down to 1.5 with sequestration and so on. So we got to prepare, guys. It's going to get tougher. It's going to get ugly. There's going to be more heat dome incidences. We need to make sure we need to prepare our energy systems. Look at the collapse of the grid in Texas in snowstorms or in heat incidences, or places around the world that I've been speaking to on the phone today that are experiencing huge temperatures. The air conditioning has stopped. They're sweltering. I was speaking to someone in Naples this morning. The air conditioning has stopped. How we make our cooling systems resilient is what I'm worried about now, because I don't want to be suffering like my friends in Vancouver were suffering in 49 degrees Celsius heat without being able to find escape from it. So, but we can design for this. We can manage it. It does require a significant change in building standards. It does require more thermal insulation of the walls and less just whacking an air conditioning unit on the side of a building and hoping for the best. So, but I want to stress the importance of looking at our social systems and how critical they are to resilience, health, income protection, inequality. These are all predictors of fragility, or if they're not there, they're predictors of fragility. If we address them, it doesn't solve everything, but we've got much more chance of bouncing back in a crash. And that's, I think, well, it's interesting, Kathy, isn't it? After years of discussion about these issues as silo issues, I will now tell you that the education of women in third world countries is directly material to the economic resilience of a third world country. Why? Because if women are educated, they participate in the economy, they start small businesses, they're much better loan risk than if they have about a 2% default rate or 3% default rate, whereas men have a 20% default rate. They drink the profits. So they're much better for the economic viability of a country. And as a result, you get lower levels of inequality. So guys, I'm talking to you guys out there because so many of you are still policymakers here. The education of women is a climate resilience activity, a critical one. And you can look at each of the UN SDGs like this. And there's a whole different take on what we've got to do and what we have to do urgently. Because the thing the pandemic tells us, it started. This climate change impacts have started.
Thank you very much.
I would ask you to comment too. I mean, a lot of this we know. This is not new. We know that it's critically important to be educating the women in our society. It's critically important for us to share accountabilities and responsibilities for the vulnerabilities that exist in our communities. We don't necessarily measure, particularly the developed world, very well, but I would suggest across the world, we don't really measure and hold as success criteria implementation strategies where we celebrate being able to move those metrics very well. But we know, and we've studied, and we've got data to suggest that this is not new. We don't need to learn. We need to act on the knowledge that we've got. Would you agree or disagree with that, Tito?
I do absolutely agree. And I do think that education, financial education also in particular, financial literacy among women is extremely important for finding better ways to deal with environmental concerns and also provide better perspective to developing countries and act on these inequalities that we were talking about before. So that is really a crucial area. And that's another area where indeed our T20 group is making proposal for the G20. It's extremely important to address that. It's indeed a very important area.
I mean, the good news is we have the capital. It's floating around. We've got a surfeit of global capital now, like never before in history. You know, negative interest rates in German bonds and Japanese bonds, for example. And we kind of know how to construct the deals. We're not doing enough of it, but we can do it, especially if we start collaborating more deeply with governments. I'm in the finance sector, collaborating with governments, particularly in emerging markets, which is going to require a little bit of direction, because most emerging market governments don't have the capability, the capacities to be able to manage all this sort of stuff. So we've got to have a relationship between the international investors and what we think we want to see, which is beginning to happen, by the way. There are a lot of big investors stepping up on this question now to drive change. I mean, tempo, as they say, that's what we're going to get to. But we do have the capital, and a lot of what we have to do can be funded. So I'm optimistic for that reason. You know, the work, Kathy, you did at Cooperators and Addenda Capital is just being replicated in institutional investors all around the world that have about $100 trillion under investment. And they're interested in change. They need to be able to pay the pensions, but they want their money to do good while doing well. And that's a big opportunity for us. So that's what the green bonds is about. We've got about 2 trillion of these things out there now. That's the whole point of a green bond, is to turn this sort of stuff into an opportunity. But it does require governments to do stuff. Blended finance, if you might say that, a spot of guarantee here, or a policy that ensures outcome X instead of outcome Y. Energy policy fit for the 21st century, for example. That's the sort of stuff we've got to work on. And if I might say, Kathy, we're a little bit slow on that agenda around the world.
Thank you very much.
We're still getting used to it.
Sean, thanks a lot. You don't see this. I'm being waved off the stage right now. So we could talk about this for many more hours, and it's been a pleasure. But I think perhaps as a conclusion, you've all, individually, you all had some very good concluding words. But I would like to add that since we're at the International Economic Forum, I think what you're getting at, and what we already know, but it's worth highlighting, is that, or reminding ourselves, is that, reducing inequality, fighting climate change, and increasing our resilience ultimately also are the key to our sustained prosperity. And that's, given the forum that we are in, I think it is worth spelling out. And so on that word, I would like to thank you, all three of you, for this very lively and enriching conversation. And I will be happy to speak with you offline later on. And thank you again. Thank you very much.